Welcome, guys, to yet another episode of Parvez's Trade. My name is Parvez Khan, and today on this episode, we'll be talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is energy. And if you haven't yet already watched my previous episodes, we covered the currency markets. We talked about USA, UK, European Union, Japan, Australia, and this video, I it'll be a six-part video series. So I'll be first starting with talking about the history of energy. And so when we talk about energy, why is it important to talk about energy? What's the historical significance of it? What does the future look like? And what does regional uh, energy consumption and production look like? And if you're a trader or someone trying to make money off it, where some opportunities out there for you now in the future. We'll talk about it all. I'm an ex-energy trader. I've traded professionally and on my own as well. So when I talk about these stuffs, I know a bit of what I'm talking about. And yeah, feel free to comment if you disagree with something I say. And I'm always open to suggestions. And obviously, I'll make some predictions, and you can look back into on this video later on in the future and see if I was right. So yeah. It'll be a six parts video series, and this is the first episode on that. And yeah, so let's get to it. And so I think first, let's give some context when, like, the importance of energy, right? People think, ah, it's such a dull thing, oil, gas, electricity. But if you, energy is basically what defined turning points in the history of mankind, in the history of civilization. And yeah, if you look through history, significant turning points happened with significant adoption of new energy methods. So I'll just give you one simple example. Like for during the Second World War, Hitler had a machine, a military machine that could outcompete, outpace almost all military machines around the world. But this huge, gigantic military mechanic machine that Hitler made, the problem with that was it was consuming a significant amount of oil. And people talk about why did Hitler go into Russia? Fighting a two-front war is a stupid idea. But one of the reasons, which I think is not talked about a lot when we talk about the Second World War, people say it was an irrational move by Hitler to go into Russia when he was already fighting in the Western Front. And I think one of the objectives that's missed out when we talk about this is that Hitler wanted to access the oil fields of Baku, Azerbaijan in Eastern Europe, right in Central Asia. And those oil fields were under the control of the Tsar of Russia back then. Sorry, the Soviet Union, right? And Hitler realized that he'd built up this huge military machine that could conquer any country at a blitzkrieg pace. But he doesn't have enough oil. He doesn't have enough energy source supplied to for this huge military machine to consume. And that was one of the reasons he went to East. He went attacked Russia. He wanted to capture the oil fields for himself. He didn't end up doing it. What ended up happening was, Stalin being Stalin, he basically ordered his troops to destroy the oil fields. So even by the time Hitler went to Baku in Azerbaijan, those oil fields were destroyed, and Hitler there was nothing for Hitler's army to use. And yeah, the that was one of the fundamental reasons why Hitler lost that war. And I think this is not talked about enough, which is that they have this huge military machine that they created, and that's guzzling on these large quantities of oil, but they don't have enough oil source. I mean, they had a good relation with uh, the Ottoman Empire, and they had access to some oil fields of the Ottoman Empire, but it wasn't enough. They needed more oil, and they realized that Baku in Azerbaijan, which was under Soviet control, had a huge oil reserve that they could access only if they conquered Eastern Europe. And in order to get into Baku, Azerbaijan, they had to go through Ukraine, and that's what brought their conquest into Russia. And yeah, it was all in or nothing moment for Hitler. He had to do it. His equipment, his military machine was literally stalling on its wheels, literally not going any further because there was no more oil. And so that was one example which showed that the importance of energy, having a critical, reliable energy source back up your military power, right? And that's one example. But yeah, I can give you another one. I think, and this is also pretty interesting. And this happened during, I believe, the 17th century or 18th century. And this was during the Opium Wars when, the British Empire was fighting the Chinese Empire. China didn't want Britain to sell its opium to the Chinese markets. And so what China did, so this was just when the Opium War started, before the Opium War started, actually. So basically, China blocked Britain from accessing any of its southern ports in Hainan and in Hong Kong. So ports near to current-day Taiwan, so ports that were close to Taiwan. Those ports were blocked for Britain to access. And the Chinese authority, the emperor, lived in Beijing. And they were pretty confident that the British could not access Beijing. Okay, so you have China, you have the southern ports. Those were blocked with chains, and so the British ships could not go into the port and trade their opium. And then if you go towards northern China, you have the Yangtze River, the Yellow River, that flows all the way to Beijing. But in order to use the Yangtze River, Yellow River, and flow is into Beijing, you need to be moving your ship upstream against the flow of water. And there was no ship at that time that could do it. And funny enough, obviously, Britain at that moment had just invented and adopted the very first steam engines. And so they identified that you can burn coal on a steamship and then use the heat to drive the steam rollers of the ship. And that ship can actually move against the tide, against the flow upstream. And no ships in the world at that time could move upstream. So China, Chinese emperor was pretty confident sitting in Beijing. No one can come and attack me here because they have to move their ships upstream, and there's no ship that can flow against the water tide. And but yeah, Britain had basically been able to harness the power of coal, the power of this new form of heat, steam, to create a ship that could move upstream. So they just basically moved upstream the Yangtze River. They went into Beijing, destroyed the house of the emperor, and yeah, they basically just surprised the emperor out of the blue. And yeah, the emperor was caught off guard, and before you know it, done. Uh, the emperor had to surrender. There was no other way out of it. And yeah, so that happened. And so that was just another example of the harnessing a new form of energy and adopting a technology to use that new form of energy to get an advantage over your opponents on the battlefield, right? And so, yeah, having access to a reliable source of energy and being able to harness new forms of energy has always been crucial to gain an edge on the battlefield throughout the history of mankind. And we live in a world right now that's has so many different forms of energy. Right now, the gossip of the 21st century is renewable energy, wind, solar. nuclear to some extent, but yeah, wind, solar, and then storing the energy in batteries. So lithium, not a form of energy, but a form of element that can be used to store the energy, right? And yeah, so lithium, cobalt, those precious metals are now being popular because they can be used to create an electrolysis uh, cell that can store the energy from solar and wind. And yeah, we have revolutionized the harnessing new and new forms of energy. Fusion is the next big deal, right? Harnessing the energy from fusion will be the next big deal. And so that's some context into the history of energy and how it shaped our current mankind. And I mean, obviously, we can talk about the US bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, people say, oh, that's not an energy, that's a bomb. I mean, it's a release of energy. If you think about it, it's a nuclear energy release. It's basically what the bomb was. And so USA was able to harness that new form of energy and put it into use, in this case, a bomb, before anyone else. And that's what gave USA an edge. And so harnessing new forms of energy and adopting them on the battleground has been crucial to get an edge in the battlefield throughout history. And so I think energy is an important topic that we should think about, we should talk about. And so yeah, on this first episode, I'm going to get into the Northern American market. So we're talking about Canada, US, Mexico to some extent. But let's just focus on Canada and USA for this episode mainly. So I worked as an energy trader in Canada. I have traded with our energy counterparties in USA, and I can tell you something, which is that US and Canada might behave like two different countries, two nations, but they have an energy infrastructure that's connected, integrated, as if they exist as one country. And which is interesting. If you look at the gas pipelines that flows from gas and oil pipelines that flows from, the oil fields in Alberta, flowing into the refineries in Midland, USA, and then the gas and oil being shipped to the LNG terminals in Texas. And yeah, it's a beautiful network. USA buys this cheap energy from Canada, it consumes it, refines it, and then sells it to Europe, right, at a premium, and to Asia to some extent. But the Asia's market is dominated by Russia. We'll talk about that in another episode. But so when we're talking about energy, we're talking about oil, gas, and electricity, right? So, I mean, yeah, US is one of the biggest consumers of oil in the world. They are energy independent right now, obviously, and they're also exporting a bit. And they take advantage of the oil reserves they have in southern US, right? That's one of the Permian Basin is one of the biggest oil reserves they have. And it's interesting because that basin, the hydraulic fracking, is the method they use to extract that oil from that basin. That basin was basically bankrupt during the COVID crisis because Saudi Arabia and Russia went into an oil war, drove oil prices down all the way to negative oil prices. And that Permian Basin in southern US basically went bankrupt for a while. And recent wars have increased the oil prices to make those hydraulic fracking methods still profitable to extract oil from that basin. And so, for those of you who don't know, Saudi Arabia, there are many countries that have oil reserves, but we're talking about the cost of extracting oil, right? The Saudi Arabia can oil reserves are the cheapest to extract. So they have the highest profit margin. Okay. And that gives them an edge. Okay. It's like China selling manufacturing products to the world because their manufacturing cost is the cheapest in the world. they have an edge whenever they want to sell their manufacturing products around the world. Saudi Arabia, similarly, because their extracting cost of their oil reserves are the cheapest anywhere in the world. And the reason they're the cheapest is not because Saudi Arabia has this amazing group of geophysicists and engineers. It's because the reserves are each oil reserve is very different. And Saudi Arabian oil reserve is just this huge chunk of oil that's been capped with this nice carbonate layer. And so you just drill a pipe into it and just sieve the oil out. It's very simple. And so it's very cheap to extract it because the characteristic of the reservoir is very nice and it's very simple. It has just this huge chunk of oil stored into this nice vase that's basically made of carbonate that stops the oil from leaking through into the sand. And so that's a very cheap way to extract oil. So that's why Saudi Arabia has the edge in selling oil and dominating the oil market. And now you come to US. This is where it's very interesting because people talk about, oh, US is now a dominant player in the oil markets. Canada, Alberta has this third largest proven oil reserves and whatnot. But we'll get to Alberta and Canada for in a bit. But let's just talk about the US's main oil reserve in southern US. There, the oil is not stored in this nice vessel of carbonate. What happens in the southern Permian Basin, basically, you have oil that's stored in little pores of rocks. So you have layers of rocks, and then the rocks, between the rocks, there are little pores, little holes, and that's where the oil seeps through and gets stored. And if you can imagine, right? So you have all these little pores between the rocks where the oil is stored. And that's if you want to extract that oil, basically, you have to go through a process called fracking. You can't just throw a pipe in there and then the oil will seep out now because there are all these small pores where oil is, right? So yeah, if you want to extract that oil, basically, you'll have to go through a process called fracking where you flood the entire system, all the pores with hydraulic fluid, and you then extract that hydraulic fluid back, and the oil uh, mixes with the hydraulic fluid and comes out. So it's a very expensive process, and it's not environmentally very safe. Hydraulic fracking has been the cause of many earthquakes in southern US, and it's one of the most expensive methods of extracting oil, right? The other one is extracting from oil sands, which is in Alberta, Canada. We'll talk about that. So out of all the methods of extracting oil around the world, hydraulic fracking that in southern US is actually one of the most expensive methods. I think the marginal cost is there. I don't know right now, but it's somewhere in the 50 to $70 per barrel. So if oil prices goes below $50 or something like that, it's not profitable to extract oil from using hydraulic fracking. And so all these wars around the world, especially in regions that's dominated by rich oil reserves like the Middle East and also Russia, these wars benefited the oil producers of southern US because oil prices jacked up high and now they're in the money to make money by producing more oil. And so what does the future look like for them? I mean, obviously Trump understands this mechanics very well. He will want to make sure oil prices stay high enough so that you know these hydraulic fracking companies don't go out of business. At the same time, he wants cheap energy for the consumers, right? So it's interesting because people think when Trump says drill baby drill, and so all these oil companies might be uh, pro-Trump, but it's actually, especially the big oil companies are actually pro-Biden because Biden is more war friendly, especially in regions with high oil reserves. That jacks up the price and that makes their oil reserves in this shale, Permian Basin shales of hydraulic fracking zones in southern US, makes those bases profitable. Trump comes in gets rid of regulation, you flood the market with supply of oil, and you drop the prices down, and then all of a sudden this hydraulic fracking is not profitable. So actually, when Trump says drill, baby, drill, the kind of oil producers that are supporting Trump are basically the small companies. So you have multinationals like Shell, Exxon, they're the big producers of oil. Then you have the small conglomerates, a couple of $1 million market cap. They probably own the rights to a few reserves here and there. They'll maybe produce 200, 300,000 barrels per month or something like that. Very small. And per year, something like that, yeah. So those small oil companies like Trump because the prop the small companies are not as focused on oil price as much as they're focused on regulations surrounding oil. So if you're a big corporation and you're scaling up your oil business, and then Joe Biden comes in and gives you all this regulation, environmental regulations to follow, as a big corporation, it's easy to comply, right? You have a big staff. Yeah, you bring in a few environmentalists to write up some EIA reports, which is environmental impact assessment reports. And boom, government, Joe Biden's government, environmental agency stamps it out. Boom, you're good to go. But if you're a small oil company, it's hard to get that extra staffing, that's extra cost, and it's burdensome. And if you're a small oil company, you're likely not going through expensive hydraulic fracking methods because you definitely don't have the capital for it. You're probably extracting from an area which is like mixed, which has some hydraulic fracking, some reservoirs that are cheap to extract just by normal drilling. And so when Trump talks about drill, baby, drill, the kind of oil producers that support him are the small and medium-sized oil producers, not the big corporations, because they benefit from the cut-in environmental regulations. They benefit They're not too worried about extracting oil using expensive fracking methods because they don't have the capital to spend in those kind of equipments. And so that's one thing. And then we come into exporting gas. So obviously, this shale also has gas. This reservoir in southern U.S. Permian Basin, it has oil and gas. And Alberta in Canada also produces oil and gas. And yeah, all this oil and gas moves around Northern America. They have a good connection of pipelines. And I think in Texas, they have an LNG terminal where they liquefy this gas. And that's actually an interesting story. So LNG terminals, the liquefaction terminals in Texas, those were actually first created in the 80s when America had an oil and gas shortage. So they had to import oil and gas from Middle East. And that's when they created this liquefaction plants in southern US. And they basically retrofitted those plants now to export gas as LNG to Europe, especially after Russia cut off the gas supply, right? So that's an interesting story. And so you have this a bunch of liquefaction plants in southern US that's exporting this gas to Europe. And yes, so then Canada recently they went through their Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. They're trying to access the Asian market by liquefying and transporting gas through their Western Canada BC terminal. And I think that's a little bit too late because West Asian markets are now dominated by Iran and Russia. And yeah, I don't think Canada will be able to compete there. So another expensive method of oil extraction is extracting from oil sands. And yeah, if you're in Alberta, you know this very well. You basically have these sands that absorb oil very well. And you're basically squeezing the oil out of these sands. And that's a very expensive and dirty method to extract the oil. And that market has been profitable recently due to increased oil prices, but obviously oil prices are going to come down in the next few years, right? And you look, people have to understand that the current oil market is very, the prices in the current oil market, like if you talk about the Brent crude price or the Western, like we're talking about the prices of oil in the Western financial markets. Those prices are elevated artificially because those financial markets don't have access to the oil price deals between, let's say, Iran and China, Russia and China. Those are secret oil deals that are being made, Iran and India or Russia and India, for example. So when you look at the oil prices in the Western financial markets, you have to take that with a pinch of salt because those prices have been artificially elevated as a result of US sanctions on oil from certain countries not being part of the transaction of US dollar. So that doesn't mean that oil doesn't exist. That doesn't mean the oil is not getting bought by someone. It's just a shadow fleet. It's outside the Western financial market. And if you adjust the Western oil prices for those sanctioned oil, I would say the oil prices, actual oil prices around the world are very much lower than what the Western financial market shows. And yeah, so there's that. And so what does the future look like, right, for the Northern American gas and oil markets? That's a good question. Trump coming into power. So